I'm going to be talking about the theory of alienation, specifically the Marxist concept of alienation. And I just want to start by saying that this is probably a theory that is not so well known, that is not so well circulated about Marx. It's something that's often downplayed or ignored. And I think that's because of its very radical and really kind of revolutionary implications. And it's kind of, the situation is that sociologists don't particularly like it because it connects social and human problems to the way the capitalist economy operates. But also more economistic versions of Marxism tend to dismiss it, tend to dismiss the theory as a kind of youthful, romantic aberration on the part of Marx because of its humanism. And what I want to contend is that the idea of alienation is actually completely central to Marxism, and that in fact you can't understand the way capitalism works without getting a sense of the way alienation operates. And also you can't understand the way, crucially, that it affects human beings. And actually, if you look at the kind of development of Marxist ideas, the idea that alienation is a very central thought concept is borne out, because the idea is absolutely key in his kind of breakthrough economic and philosophical notebooks that he wrote in 1844, which was one of the first. It's kind of the moment where he, in a sense, became a Marxist, fully became a Marxist. And although he and Engels tended to use the actual word alienation less and less in later life, the actual concept of it and the associated concepts remain completely central to both their theory and their practice, including in the great later economic work, Capital. So I'm arguing for the real importance of this idea, even if it's not necessarily described in the terms of alienation. Sometimes it's the way it's written about can be complicated. Actually, the central idea is not very complicated, but it does have a whole range of kind of implications in various different aspects of capitalist life and the way capitalism operates that take some kind of discussion. And I'm going to try, obviously, to outline the basic idea and also to begin to look at some of those implications before we move on to discussion. So what Marx meant by it, essentially, is this. Human beings, Marx argued, human beings' essential nature, the thing that distinguishes us from the rest of the animal world, is our ability to consciously and collectively labor on the world and to transform it. That was human nature for Marx. It is this ability to labor that obviously produces goods. Beyond that, it even produces, if you think about it, it produces the whole world around us. It produces institutions, it produces industry itself, it produces towns, it produces cities. Our ability to labor ultimately produces society and produces civilization. And in this sense, you can go one step beyond that and to say that our ability, our involvement in conscious cooperative labor actually produces us as humans. It produces human society and human civilization. Now, the problem that we face under capitalism, and in a slightly different way under previous class societies, the problem we face is that this ability to consciously and collectively and cooperatively labor on the world is taken away from us. It is taken away from us first and foremost because those that do the laboring in society, those that do the work, workers, the working class, actually have no control over what they produce or how they produce it. And so in that sense, their labor is not cooperative, is not collective, and it's not under their control. What actually happens is that, as we all know, our labor, our work is used to produce products that are sold on to make a surplus value for others or profit for others, the people that own and control industry. They're not produced for us. They're not produced either for us individually or produced for us in the sense of produced in a collective cooperative way for society as a whole. So under capitalism, far from being consciously cooperative, the labour process is completely dominated by the needs of profit, by the demands of capital. And this has a huge impact, just looking first of all at the world of work. The drive to maximise profits leads to a kind of extreme and inhuman division of labour. It leads to kind of huge sort of ruthless discipline, regulation, monitoring that we all experience at work. And the result of this is devastating. You get a situation where a high division of labour, the kind of fragmentation of the process of production leads to the fragmentation of the human being themselves. It leads to our transformation almost into our opposite, into machines. I want to read, just because I came across it recently, a very brief description of, in an Italian novel by a guy called Nanni Balestrini called We Want Everything, about the experience of going into a factory for someone who moved from the south of Italy in the late 1960s, about the first day he had in the factory, just to give a sense of this process. He worked in a Fiat factory, and he said, on the Fiat line, it's not a question of learning, but of getting your muscles used to it, of getting used to the force of those movements and the rhythms. Having to place a whatchamacallit every 20 seconds meant you had movements quicker than a heartbeat. That is a finger, your eye, any part was forced to move in tenths of a second, forced actions in fraction of a second. The action of choosing the two washers, the action of choosing the two bolts, those movements were actions your muscles and your eyes had to make by themselves without you deciding anything. I just had to keep up the rhythm of all those movements, repeated in order and equally. That sense that, you know, I think many people can kind of identify with, that work takes you over, that work is not just out of your control, but actually ends up controlling you. And that really is a very good description of the immediate human impact of alienation on the worker. Marx also wrote very, very movingly at some length about this. He wrote in the work I referred to, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the more the worker exerts himself in his work, the more powerful the alien objective world becomes, which he brings into being over against himself. The poorer he and his inner world become, and the less they belong to him. In his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself, does not feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical energy, but mortifies his soul and mortifies his body and ruins his mind. So the immediate focus here is on the impact that alienation has on workers, and it is at work, amongst workers, that alienation takes its most extreme and, in a sense, characteristic form. In fact, in the words of George Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist, who wrote a good deal about this subject, and I'll come back to, in his words, the fate of the worker expresses the fate of the whole of society. And this is because the way production is organized, the kind of relations of production, shape society as a whole. They don't just affect the process of production, the immediate experience of work, they shape the whole of society. And these relations are actually out of human control. They're based on commodity production, and commodity production is a competitive system in which prices, supply, investment decisions, and so on are shaped not just by the needs of profit, but also by unplanned interactions on the market. And it's worth thinking about the market and the role the market plays here, because when the market is described as free, what this really means is precisely that it is a mechanism that is free from collective human conscious control. So what you end up with is, on the one hand, the ownership and control of production by exploiters, by capitalists, who are trying to create a profit from the workers at the point of production, but also, on the other hand, the organization of the wider economy through the competitive anarchy of the market. And the two things are connected, but both important. So taken together, I think it's important that we sort of grasp the extent of alienation and the way that it affects every aspect of society. It means that human beings are alienated from nature, even though we are actually a part of nature, because we have no control over the way that we as a whole interact with the natural world. It means, as I've already suggested, that we are alienated from ourselves because we no longer have any control over the very thing that makes us human, which is our ability to labour and transform the world. And it means as well that we are alienated from other people because we have no control over the society through which we interact with others, the society that organises our lives. So it's a very deep-seated, very radical thing, the way in which capitalism alienates human beings. And I want to go on to talk about some of the implications of this analysis briefly. And I want to just mention three broad things. The first one, just to go back to this question of the way that alienation affects aspects of society outside the immediate realm of production, which, as I say, is something that the Hungarian Marxist George Lukács emphasised and explored very importantly. And he argued that in all the institutions of society under capitalism take on, in a way, aspects of the factory system. You get a regimented, fragmented, monitored way of approaching reality, which becomes the norm in education, in schools and in universities. It becomes, it actually even takes over or shapes the way services are delivered, the health service, the justice system, the arts even, the media. You get a compartmentalization of human affairs, a kind of universe of specialization, which finds expression in the bureaucratization of all of these kind of areas of life. And the outcome is that humans are we're treated as kind of numbers or units, and that all the different elements of our lives are separated and compartmentalized. And this has a very, very deep effect on the experience of living under capitalism, even outside the immediate world of production. And in a way, this process has reached a kind of very extreme form under neoliberalism, where these areas that used to be at least nominally under state control, so many of them are more and more coming directly under the control of the market, are directly commodified in education, in health, public services, and so on and so forth. So it's, as well as affecting institutions, all of this inevitably affects our everyday life, our personal lives. The conditions of alienation created by commodity production has that kind of profound effect where it even distorts our personal relations, it distorts our family life. Being powerless at work, being powerless where you spend most of your time, being powerless at the point where you're involved in what makes you human, also makes you feel powerless in terms of other aspects of your life. So our private lives are affected by our so-called private lives, our personal relations, and so on and so forth. Even our needs and our wants are shaped by this process. And Marx talks about the way in which the market creates imaginary needs and imaginary wants, because rather than being involved in a collective discussion about what should be produced and what people want and need, we're faced with the situation where our needs and wants are gratified only in ways that contribute to the accumulation of profit. And this itself is decided in these impersonal processes of the market. So the more you think about it, the more you realize the extent to which the reality of alienation really does affect people profoundly. Even the ruling class cannot escape alienation. Because the system is based on, although you have the ruling class, individuals or corporations do actually have control over some sections of the economy, because the economy is overall based on anarchy, they don't actually have a complete control over society as a whole. So even they face an alienated reality, although, as Marx quite rightly and cleverly says, they're comfortable in their alienation. And in a certain sense, they see in alienation their own power and their own control, at least in a limited sense. So they're not going to be in rebellion against it, but nevertheless, it does affect the way they think and understand the world. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is about the sort of scale and the depth of alienation, is that it needs to lead us in, or it should lead us to very radical kind of political and social conclusions. I think it's an understanding that points to the fact that it will take more than political reforms or a different government to generate real advance and real progress and real liberation for human beings. Because what is at stake here is a question of popular control over production. There's no other way that alienation can be overcome except through the democratization of the economy. And that's not something that's going to happen through the kind of parliamentary mechanisms that exist under society, however important they may be. In a way, parliament and capitalist politics is itself an expression of alienation, because parliament has no control, actually, when you think about it, over the economy. It has very little control over what happens in the workplace. And so you can't really use alienated tools to overcome alienation. And Marx's understanding that the fundamental problem of class society is the lack of popular control over production and over everyday life, over work and so forth, is precisely that understanding that made him, above all, a revolutionary. The third implication, and the last one I want to talk about, is might seem paradoxical, because the truth is alienation and understanding alienation can help us explain why it is that workers are not in a state of permanent rebellion against the capitalist system. Alienation is as I've described, it's an objective term that describes the actual lack of control that workers, and by extension everyone else in capitalist society, suffer from. It creates this lack of control, this immediate lack of control can create a sense of passivity, a sense of powerlessness, atomization, a sense of, having almost like a contemplative view of the world where things are just happening and we're not in control. And that's very, very powerful. And that can be very, very demobilizing and demotivating. There's a second aspect to this, which is that the specific form in which alienation appears under capitalism, which Lukács called reification, the turning of processes and relations into things, also has the effect of creating illusions about how society works. As a result of commodity production, what are really at heart human relations, including relations of exploitation, take on the appearance in our minds as as being relations between things. And Marx writes here about the most obvious example of this is the market and the way we experience being consumers and so on. And Marx talks about it where he says, a worker who buys a loaf of bread and a millionaire who does the same appear in this act only as simple buyers, just as in respect of them, the grocer only appears as a seller. All other aspects here are extinguished. The content of these purchases, how they were produced, etc., like their extent, here appears irrelevant when compared with the formal aspect. So the whole process of marketization and commodification of everyday life leads to a situation where the actual exploitative relations that exist between workers and capitalists can be completely obscured, or can appear to be obscured. And the structure of the wage system is perhaps another very important aspect of this, because what you have in the wage relation is an essentially unequal exchange between the capitalist who employs you to make a profit, but an unequal exchange between the working capitalist that appears, superficially at least, to be equal to both sides of the contract. So the result is that the alienation can create passivity, it can create powerlessness, a sense of illusion about how processes actually work. And it generates the kind of, it creates the conditions in which ruling class ideas about the impossibility of planning, the idea that we're all greedy, that we're all disconnected individuals, that there is no such thing as society. Alienation creates the conditions in which these ideas can thrive. It creates conditions in which, and all sorts of different versions of them, including postmodernist ideas of there's no such thing as reality even, you know. But these ideas can only really have a purchase because of alienation and reification. So in some senses, this can seem like quite a depressing picture, really. You know, misery at work, illusions generated by the experience of work, by the experience of living under capitalism. And some of these insights have at different times been used to paint that kind of picture, kind of gloomy picture in which working people can't see through the veils of reification and so forth. And there was a whole tradition of Marxist or or I'd say pseudo-Marxist or semi-Marxist thought that really talks up that side of the situation. And you've seen it recently, the sort of general pessimism from some of the critics of neoliberalism who talk about a neoliberal subject. You see it in the work of Mark Fisher, to be honest, Capitalist Realism. You know, there's no way we can see through the fog of reification and alienation. This is nothing to do with what Marx or Lukács were talking about or what they intended. Part of the importance of the theory of alienation is actually to insist that we're capable of something very different, that we are actually capable of collective conscious creation and organization of society, and that this is a potential which is not just a possibility, but is really the heart of our nature. And so while a society based on cooperative production is not an inevitability, it is something that is very realistic to strive for. And actually, it's a very, the Marxist theory of alienation is because it is a description of this misery as being a product of a particular historical form, it's a counter to the fashionable kind of pessimism of the postmodernists or those like Foucault who believe power is everywhere and these kind of people, because it's saying that this condition is not the human condition, but it's based in a particular historical experience. And finally, and most importantly, the theory of alienation has within it an understanding of how it can be overthrown, of how alienation can be challenged, because capitalism has a particular problem with commodification. It has a problem with the commodification of labor power, because as Marx pointed out, labor power is a commodity totally unlike any other, because its owners, the owners of labor power, workers, have the ability to challenge the purchaser over our price, or even to rebel against our status as a commodity. In an unconnected way, this was an issue that the car manufacturer Henry Ford was referring to when he used to complain, why is it every time I ask for a pair of hands, they come with a brain attached? So commodifying workers is actually quite a problematic operation. And the process of the exploitation of labor, in other words, can always break out, and regularly does break out, into a power struggle between boss and worker over the terms of exploitation, and resulting strikes or conflicts or battles have the potential, they don't always, but they're always radicalizing, to be honest. They always challenge. Anyone who's been on strike knows, or sees, been in touch with strikers know that when you go on strike, you are beginning to ask some serious questions about what is going on, and they can develop, particularly if they spread, particularly if the state, the police or the media or the government get involved in strikes, they can become very politicized. And ultimately, they can lead to generalized rebellions against exploitation, generalized rebellions against alienation itself, actually. And if you look at it, every great revolutionary movement since capitalism has been in existence has had such strikes by workers as part of it, very often at its heart. And the relationship between the exploitative relationship between capitalists and workers, while it has these aspects, on the one hand, that I've described, aspects of alienation, which can mystify the situation that people are in. It also has other aspects which lead to a confrontation that can be incredibly clarifying. And this is the basis of what we tend to call contradictory consciousness, that workers at all times have an element of both sides of this equation, an element of both sides of this experience and both sides of this reality in their minds. Just very finally, problems don't end when struggles break out. Alienation and reification are not overthrown simply by a particular strike, even if it's a very big strike, not even by mass, insurgent movements automatically and immediately. And the implications of that point are very important in terms of organisation and politics and so forth. And we need to discuss those implications. But this question of struggle really is a vital question. And it was vital for Marx. And when he wrote the German ideology, he and Engels wrote the German ideology in 1845, which really was the kind of the first, the summation of his first period of development. The German ideology ends with a very, very strong passage where he talks about it's precisely the big struggles against the system that begin the process of people being able to overcome the effects of alienation and to throw off what he calls the muck of ages, the things about capitalism that distort and alienate and create illusions in our minds. This is actually why, and he says it, this is actually why Marx argued that a revolutionary movement was necessary. Not just necessary to fundamentally transform the world, but necessary to overthrow alienation, and in the process of transforming the world, transform ourselves. Thank you.